In this video, I'm going to talk about something called prose poetry. And if you've never heard of prose poetry, you could be forgiven for thinking I just made a mistake, that actually what I meant was prose or poetry. But no, we're talking about something called prose poetry. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I think the best thing to do is start with an example. And I've got my laptop here, and with the click of a button, you will be able to see exactly what I'm looking at on the screen here. So let's get started. So here I am on the website of the Sierra Nevada Review, a fantastic literary magazine, and I will put a link in the description below. Please do check out their website and the wonderful poems that they have on that site. And here is a copy of my poem Inheritance, and I make no claims about this being the finest example of the form available. It's just an example, but I happen to own the copyright, so for the purposes of this video, that's why I've chosen it, and it's also a springboard into a broader discussion about exactly what prose poetry is. So I'm going to start by just reading this out loud. Inheritance. I spend the morning in the dentist's chair, staring at the reflection of my open mouth in her glasses, hands and tools reaching in, a silent scream suctioned out, the porcelain crown chattering into place like a cup in saucer. This is my inheritance. Besides the house and fine bone china tea set, these bloody English teeth. Once I read, could have been while browsing magazines in a dentist waiting room, that bone china is made by mixing bovine ash into the clay. But one supposes human ash would do. Later, Google yields a potter who'll throw your loved one for a price. Perhaps a vase, my thoughtful wife suggests, but I think you'd suit breakfast bowls. It was your favorite time of day. And if I dropped one of you, there'd be a wisecrack from brother Tim about your gin and how you were far more smashed than that last Christmas. The Yanomami tribe grinds the bones of their deceased and drinks them in a soup. National Geographic, dentist waiting room, circa 2007. I too wish you could be part of me forever. The dentist advises not to eat for several hours and says the numbness wears off with time. There's an example of a prose poem. As a free verse poet, you, the poet, determine where one line ends and the next one begins. And I've spoken previously about the importance of line endings to the free verse poet. Certainly you will hear lots of discussion about that if you go to a poetry workshop. In a formal poem, it is the metrical structure of the received form that determines where one line ends and the next one starts. In other words, it's to do with that regular pattern of beats, and when we fulfill that pattern of beats on one line, we need to move on to the next line. In a prose poem, what's happening is that what's determining the end of the line is actually the right-hand margin, in exactly the same way that would happen with a piece of prose writing. When the text reaches the right-hand margin, the sentence continues on the following line. So prose poetry kind of masquerades as a piece of prose on the page when you look at the poem without reading it. So, what determines that it is a poem and not a short piece of fiction, such as microfiction or flash fiction? That's also a very difficult question to answer, because we might say that, well, there are elements of this poem that we associate more with poetry than prose. It could be any number of literary devices, perhaps the use of alliteration, perhaps the use of rhyme. Maybe the poem speaks and uses metaphorical language or simile. Maybe it's more a lyric poem than a narrative poem. That with prose we might associate more strongly with this idea of a narrative arc. That can occur also in a prose poem, but it may be that the poem actually constellates around a kind of focal point in the same way that a lyric poem does. But microfiction and flash fiction can also do that. It may be that they don't follow the conventions that we most strongly associate with narrative short form fiction. It may be that they are behaving more like poetry, but in a prose form. I think also an important factor is that the poem defines itself as a poem, that the writer is presenting this work to you as a piece of poetry. So that in itself carries some weight and gives us a kind of insight into what the writer is doing. It's actually not correct to say that the writer doesn't determine where the line endings occur, because to a certain extent they do. The poet has ceded control, so that a decision has been made not to write this poem as a free verse poem, but to actually cede control to the right-hand margin, if you like. One trick of prose poetry, in my view, is that it kind of pulls the reader in. It feels much more accessible to many readers than a poem might do, just from looking at it on the page. The fact that we're so familiar with what prose looks like, the fact that nothing special is being said by the line endings in the way that we might expect in a free verse poem. I also wanted to talk about the poetry of other writers in this video, and I'm going to start with Jose Hernandez Diaz. Here is his collection, The Fire Eater, and another Bad Mexican, Bad American. He has two other collections, The Parachutist from Sundress Publications, and from Red Hen Press, based right here in Southern California, a collection called Portrait of the Artist as a Brown Man. This poet does extraordinary things with the prose poem. As you can see, the collections are filled up with prose poetry. And what he does, what I really love about the poetry in these collections, is that the poet transports the reader through a mix of humor and magical realism into other places, and then hits you with the kind of sucker punch of what it means to be, I suppose, an artist of color or a person of color living in this part of the world right now, among many other things as well. And that's not the only thing this poet is exploring, but certainly lots of his poems do. I just love that what he does is to be able to take the reader on a journey, sometimes through these sort of magical realism sort of elements, and do it so well. So check out his poetry. I will put a link in the description below. And the second poet I wanted to mention today is Tom Laichas, and this collection in particular, 300 Streets of Venice, California. I recently wrote a review on this collection, and I will put a link in the description to that review. And without giving too much away, each of the poems in here, and predominantly prose poetry in this collection, and each one of the poems is named after a street in Venice, California, and the speaker kind of wanders through these streets, travels through these streets, and the streets themselves become a way of exploring the transience, if you like, of the human condition. It's very, very powerful, and in places funny, and always poignant. So I highly recommend this collection from Tom Laichas and these two that I mentioned from Jose Hernandez Diaz. And there's lots more prose poetry for you to explore out there. One thing we can be absolutely certain of about the prose poem is that whatever it does, and it can really do extraordinary things, it certainly does blur the boundaries between what a piece of prose is and what a poem is, and also challenge our, preconceived ideas about what a poem is or what a poem can be. As always, thank you very much for watching, and if you like this video, please do click on the like and the subscribe button, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that, but it really does help the channel to grow. You can also click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, where you will also find links to these books that I've been mentioning today. So thanks for watching, thanks for your support, and I'll be back really soon with more poetry content.